Hi, folks. Welcome to U.S. Supreme Court March Madness Bracketology. I'm your host, Christian Boudreau. Well, we're going to start off in the Constitution region with the number one seed, Marbury versus Madison. This team is led by great play in the paint and some really good passing. Marbury versus Madison truly gave the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. And in the 8th seed in the Constitution region, we have U.S. versus Lopez, and it ruled that guns are not allowed on or carried on school campuses. Now, moving on to the Bill of Rights region, we have the number one seed, Gideon versus Wainwright. It granted criminals an attorney even if they could not afford one because of the Fifth or Sixth Amendment. This team is led by great outside shooting and a phenomenal backcourt. Now moving on to the 8th seed in the Bill of Rights region. We have Texas versus Johnson. This upheld burning of the flag as a right of the First Amendment. Now moving on to the Civil Rights region. We have Brown versus Board of Education. Now, this is the best team going into the tournament. They've had a great season all year, great conference play. They are the team to beat, the 1990 Duke Blue Devils. This set a standard for schools and a precedent for civil rights that ruled segregated schools unconstitutional. Watch out for them in the tournament. And the 8th seed in the Civil Rights region, we have Griswold versus Connecticut. This was marital privacy in regards to contraceptive use. Now, moving on to the political process region, Miranda versus Arizona set a standard for criminal rights and established what we now know as the Miranda rights. And in the 8th seed, Korematsu versus U.S., while not applicable today, it ruled for internment of Japanese Americans. Now for upsets in the Bill of Rights region. We have D.C. versus Heller, gun ownership for homeowners, established in 2008, against upsetting New York Times versus U.S., which made it legal to publish papers regarding Nixon's Watergate scandal at the time. Now, in the civil rights region, we have an upset of Loving versus Virginia for making it unconstitutional about laws regarding interracial marriage, upsetting Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld separate versus equal, which was a pivotal case at the time, but not strong enough to beat Loving versus Virginia. And in the political process region, we have Baker versus Carr, which ruled that legislative apportionment was a justiciable issue. Beating Shelby County versus Holder, which stated Section 4 and 5 are unconstitutional regarding pre-clearance of state and local voting laws. Now we have upsets coming out of the Sweet 16. In the Bill of Rights region, we had Schenck versus U.S. coming out on top against New York Times versus Sullivan. Both huge cases in the Bill of Rights, but Schenck versus U.S., the Espionage Act did not violate the First Amendment. You can't incriminate yourself with what you say, and New York Times versus Sullivan really dealt more with libel. So Schenck versus U.S. came out on top. In the civil rights region, we have Obergefell versus Hodges upsetting the number one seed Brown versus Board of Education. I think mostly due to its presence today, really everywhere, legalization of gay marriage. Obergefell versus Hodges took the win on this one against Brown versus Board of Ed. Really surprised about this one. Brown versus Board of Ed, one of the largest, biggest, most influential cases in civil rights. But they just didn't have it together versus a very young and talented Obergefell versus Hodges team. Now, in the political process region, we have Baker versus Carr upsetting Bush versus Gore. Now, Baker versus Carr was Supreme Court involvement in legislative apportionment, a bit more influential today. Not as much then because Bush versus Gore was pretty really influential then with the recounting of ballots in the Florida local state election. So there you go, folks. Moving on to the Elite Eight, we have Marbury versus Madison taking on McCullough versus Maryland in this one. Out of the Constitution region, we saw Marbury versus Madison in a very tight matchup, their closest game all year against McCullough versus Maryland. Both great teams, great coaching, great talent, but we did see Marbury versus Madison, one of the most influential cases of all time, giving the Supreme Court power of judicial review, coming out on top. Very close out the gates. Now, mind you, McCullough versus Maryland established implied powers, both very influential today, very influential at the time, but we see Marbury versus Madison moving on to the Final Four. Can't wait to see their next game. Now, in the Elite Eight for the Bill of Rights region, we have Gideon versus Wainwright taking on Schenck versus U.S. Now, we did have Gideon versus Wainwright winning that game by a pretty large margin. Gideon versus Wainwright is really the criminals grant an attorney, even if you can't afford one. We all know about that. Your right to an attorney, and they came out on top in that one. Now, in the civil rights region, we had Obergefell versus Hodges against Roe versus Wade. Both huge cases today, still very important, but I really saw Obergefell versus Hodges 2015 case coming out on top. One of the biggest cases we all know today, still huge in the news, really changed marriage laws, and they just had that one locked up against Roe versus Wade. Still, Roe versus Wade, a great team, but sadly they're out of the tournament. Now, in the political process region, we have Miranda versus Arizona taking on Baker versus Carr. This is an easy one here, folks. I gotta tell you, Miranda versus Arizona established the Miranda rights. We still see it today. It is the key proponent to really the criminal process and reading your Miranda rights, and they really just handled this game well versus Baker versus Carr. There's really no contest between the two. Baker versus Carr really can step up to that number one seed play, really. Now, folks, we have, coming out of the Final Four, here we go. We have Obergefell versus Hodges taking on Miranda versus Arizona. We both know these are some huge court cases we're dealing with, some of the biggest landmark cases of all time. We have the East region, the West region. We have Marbury versus Madison taking on Gideon versus Wainwright. Obergefell versus Hodges, Miranda versus Arizona. And folks, these were both close matchups. I'm not going to say otherwise. Marbury versus Madison really was relentless coming out the gates in the first half. Gideon versus Wainwright did a good job handling that strong Marbury versus Madison team with a great backcourt. Really some great outside shooting from both teams, but Marbury versus Madison moves on. Judicial review, one of the biggest things we see today, still holding its own in the political process and the Constitution. Judicial review is huge, and we see two great teams coming out of the West region. Obergefell versus Hodges took the win on this one. Really just so huge today. In the last 3 years, Obergefell versus Hodges has really been so influential in marriage laws, and that makes our national championship game Obergefell versus Hodges taking on Marbury versus Madison. Now, going into this game, I wasn't so sure who was going to win. They're both great teams, led by some very young talent on the Obergefell versus Hodges team, with the Roberts Court and Marbury versus Madison, really led by some great players and awesome talent. But in this game, we had Marbury versus Madison taking the win. Judicial review just takes precedent over the change of marriage laws. I think it's huge today. We see it so much. And there you go, folks. You're national champion.